Hello, you're watching the race for immortality. Today we have Petr and Vita Stepanova. Vita Stepanova is new here, but there's a reason she's here. Vita is a revolutionary. Vita is making a revolution in the use of multi-agent systems in longevity, in life extension, in achieving all the most wonderful things, namely increasing lifespan. Right now, we're living in the era, the summer of 2025. This is the revolution of hackathons in the field of longevity, because new tools have appeared that didn't exist before. And I think there will be a boom in the use of multi-agent systems. So when these tools appeared, I think that the field of fighting aging itself will become very closely integrated with hackathons, competitions, and, with the use of artificial intelligence. And Vita is with us, and together we organized everything. Vita led our first hackathon. And Vita, go ahead, the floor is yours. This is going to be very interesting.
Hello, friends. I'm glad to be here today in your warm company. I'm happy to tell you about how we organized our first hackathon as part of what we hope will be a big series of hackathons dedicated to fighting aging using multi-agent systems. Here, I completely share Misha's view that there haven't been any revolutionary breakthroughs in aging for quite some time. And we believe that the emergence of artificial intelligence and the opportunities it gives us, the ability to integrate a huge amount of information, to use this vast amount of data, and to leverage AI to generate new ideas, can truly help us solve the problems of life extension. Inspired by these ideas, and remembering that we once organized hackathons on bioinformatics, medical informatics, and even, we had one hackathon with skincare. Using all the tools and experience we had accumulated back then, we decided to launch our own series of hackathons, which literally kicked off just a week ago. We started with a Russian language hackathon, where we gave our participants the opportunity, first of all, we were curious to see how many people this event would attract. And probably the first thing that pleasantly surprised me was how many people wanted to participate, even though we didn't do a lot of promotion. We didn't have an extensive marketing campaign for this event. Our prizes weren't very big compared to what you often see at some ML competitions. Despite everything, the level of interest from people was really high. We had people from all sorts of backgrounds coming in. Just the day before yesterday, during the presentations, we heard that a lot of new people have entered the industry. People came from marketing, from sales, from investment backgrounds. Everyone said they were interested in trying both multi-agency and, solving longevity problems. I was especially pleased that there were people who, for example, had never used or tried to write their own agents. And our first week of work inspired them to do this. And when we tested this interest, this hypothesis, it became clear to us that we actually have quite a lot of participants, and the quality of the participants, the quality of their knowledge, is really very high. We realize that we are probably ready to keep experimenting with these teams and give them different tasks in terms of implementation. We had one task that was strictly defined and determined, which was given by Petr team and Gero. We had a second task, which was given by the Open Genes team, and it was also quite strictly validated, but at the same time allowed for a fairly wide range of solutions. And we had a third task, which was formulated in the most abstract way possible, because in part it was our goal to see how the teams would behave. Some of them had just come together, some had never worked in our domain, in longevity, or, say, in agent-based systems. But how realistic is it to open up, to make an open-ended task and see how people approach solving it? And I believe that our experiment was an absolute success, because we definitely answered for ourselves the question about the possibilities, about the technical capabilities that we have even within just 1 week of a hackathon. And overall, I think we can predict what we could achieve if the hackathon or a series of hackathons lasted longer. And secondly, we answered for ourselves the question, would we want to narrow down the task, or would we prefer to take a more philosophical approach to how some tasks are formulated? Here, I think we also managed to answer that question for ourselves. And some teams that came up with unexpected solutions to an openly formulated problem actually helped us realize that, indeed, sometimes we can give people a task without a solution or without an obvious solution, thus inspiring them to look for completely new and unexpected answers, ones that even the curators or organizers hadn't considered in their own thinking. Which is also really great. I think that's one of the main key strengths of a hackathon. To bring people together in such a way that they can think about certain problems in a new way. Here, I believe we definitely succeeded in that, and I'm really glad we started this work, and I hope this is truly just the beginning. We already have a ton of follow-ups.
That's our story.
We'll talk about that a bit later too.
Petr, what's your impression of the hackathon, the teams, and the challenges?
Look, first of all, it was the effect of a pleasant surprise. I mean, when I saw that there were 200, almost 250 people registered in the Telegram chat, and just on our challenge alone, almost 60 people were working. The scale is impressive, the energy of 60 people over 3 to 5 days. 300 people is a lot. And the teams weren't just 1 or 2 people, as I understand it, they were tight-knit groups. Sometimes you could see that teams of several people came together, like 5 or 6 people in one team. But the participants always bring their human energy, and we put a challenge up for the hackathon. We have an inside joke in the company. We have the Gero scale, the Gero company scale. So each challenge has its own scale. We specifically put forward a challenge that was kind of on the lower end of that scale, but the advantage was that it was very clearly formulated, so it was very easy to assess the quality of the solution. And to our surprise, in just 3 days, 2 teams built solutions that passed very strict checks. In my opinion, this is a good lesson for the future that you can set the scale. You can increase the scale of ambition. The problem is what Vita was talking about. That's it. And secondly, maybe I'll say something a bit contrary now, but a hackathon is, by definition, a competition. And as soon as you have a competition, it's obvious that the participants will want to be judged as objectively as possible. In this sense, open-ended tasks, in my opinion, somewhat contradict the hackathon format. A hackathon is well suited for solving problems whose solutions can be quantitatively evaluated, especially when we're talking about people, about machine learning specialists. These are people who are comfortable with numbers, can easily compare themselves to each other, and so on. So, I guess that was a long speech. The short answer is, I'm impressed. Impressed to the point that, at my next hackathon participation, our approach will be different. That is, we'll make some organizational changes. The main thing is, I'd suggest judging artistry separately, like in sports, and techniques separately as well. It's essential for a hackathon to have well-defined tasks that can be judged objectively. And as for open-ended tasks and evaluating artistry, I think in the future those should be put into a separate category.
That's a really big question when it comes to judging. Because, of course, it would be great to have objective metrics as an outcome, but that would mean the task is pretty simple, since we'd only have one objective metric in the area of increasing life expectancy. But it's impossible to achieve that at a hackathon, and sometimes we're just working with ideas that still need to be validated. You can actually change the judging panels and end up getting, well, different subjective opinions. Well, just now, all of us were judges ourselves, and the thing is, our judging panel actually hires people to work specifically on the hackathon topic. One of them, Andre, who isn't here right now at Beeve, their company, is ready to allocate $10 million for strong solutions. So their perspective is subjective as well. And here I have to disagree with you. I don't think we should do away with objective metrics. We just need to make it clearer that this is a subjective opinion. That's simply how these people see it. It's just that a different set of judges might have a different subjective view. But what if we now? Well, listen, let's take a look. On one side of the scale, we have people who are in the industry, who pay money, who hire people, and their opinion is very important. And on the other side, yes, we can move towards very objective metrics, but then we narrow down the range of tasks we can take on so that an algorithm can directly calculate who won and who didn't. That's just how it is. But what do we get from those tasks? They're just different. Another question is, maybe we need to run the events in parallel.
Split them up.
Yeah, not even tracks, but the events themselves. Completely different types of hackathons, so that here we have one approach where it's totally subjective, and that's fine. And here we have an approach where the algorithm directly counts whether the tasks are done or not. And I really liked that recently an article by Linda Patries came out, saying that tomatoes and the anti-tumor drug temetinib produced a good combined effect. If each substance alone extended the lifespan of mice by about 10 to 17%, then the combination gave 34.9% for males and 27.4% for females in terms of lifespan extension. And what does this have to do with the hackathon? Basically, a computer, a program, and AI should be able to predict this combination based on retrospective data. And in general, all the combinations we have should be predicted, as well as new combinations. If we can create such a predictor from these hackathons right now, that would be incredible. Naturally, this team deserves recognition for their solutions. In other words, if they're making progress, it's extremely important for the field to learn how to predict combinations. That's it. And, well, as for how objectively we or someone else will choose, only time will tell when the problem is solved, when the problem of extending life is solved. Vita, go ahead. Not all viewers know this. In fact, I'd say none of the viewers know this. What problems were we solving there?
Let me tell you about two of the problems that weren't from Gero, not from the company Gero, and Petr will talk about the problem from Gero. We had a total of 3 problems. One of them was presented by a team. Open Genes, which works on attributing aging benchmarks, among other things, in addition to all their other work. And the task was to correctly attribute the aging benchmark and to automatically update the database, because, as we know, database updates are often done manually, which leads to a lot of problems with errors, different interpretations, and inconsistent use of certain nomenclature or terms. Actually, if we learned how to do it, if we came up with good criteria for identifying benchmarks and at the same time learned how to automatically update our database, this would really allow the industry to move forward significantly, because it would accelerate the speed of working with various types of, at least, genetic information. And by the way, it seemed to us that the teams who presented solutions to this task handled the combination of presentations, answering the given question, and finding some original alternative solution the best. I think this is a good question for us as organizers as well, that maybe we need more tasks of this kind, which would allow us to accumulate both interesting perspectives on solutions and technical solutions themselves. And the second task, which we even called the Nizar task, because it seems so high level, well, you'll understand in a moment why we call it high level, came to us exactly when we started thinking, if we're going to organize a hackathon, what kind of tasks would we want to give the participants at this hackathon? And we realized that, actually, this is a good question that we could address to agent systems, multi-agent systems, in the future. And then we had this idea, what if we invite our participants to reflect, to think, to imagine, and to code on the topic of, let's try to answer today the question, what is the most important problem of aging that we should be solving? And it seems to us, it still seems that this is quite a curious and interesting challenge, because you can approach it from so many different angles. Someone might approach it by evaluating current articles and assigning certain weights to different knowledge bases or fields of study in order to determine which area or field is currently the most influential, the most interesting. In our discussions about this challenge, we came up with one of the parameters for how to identify the fastest growing, most trending field, which also seemed quite interesting to us. At the very beginning, we encouraged our participants to go further, not to look only at PubMed or just at articles, but to consider how there are certain societal factors that might be holding us back, perhaps, in the study of longevity, including, some media outlets, news, tweets, public discussions, political realities, and so on. The same demographic factors, like how pension funds operate, the increase in life expectancy, the growing number of people living after retirement, and so on, all while birth rates are declining. Jumping ahead a bit, I'll say right away that none of the teams really went in this direction. People still mostly focused on scientific knowledge and scientific data. But even in this field, the solutions that were proposed, the interesting ideas that the teams crystallized, we felt that they are truly valuable and worth working on further, spending more time with them. We would like to invite some teams, regardless of whether they became prize winners or not, to continue exploring this issue with us, because some of the solutions were quite unexpected and therefore even more valuable.
I truly think that we've only just barely scratched the very surface of this incredibly important task, because it is absolutely essential for us to effectively move forward and collaboratively generate novel hypotheses together with the sophisticated neural network, and somehow learn to accurately evaluate these potential hypotheses even before they are rigorously tested, in order to precisely compare them with each other. And here, of course, we really need to think hard so that our task doesn't just turn into, well, we have this knowledge game, we've made it, but there was too much focus on knowledge games. So on generalizing information, that's kind of the very first book on the shelf, and unfortunately, we've just shown that we have it, that it's sitting there, this book, and that's it. So here, this ideology of tasks is both very specific and very general. This is very general, and you shouldn't be afraid of it or try to hint at the solution. I mean, it's going to dominate in some way, and in my opinion, it hasn't been found yet. That's it. So how do you choose the best task? There's neither a principle nor an architecture. So how do you choose the best longevity task? It still remains very mysterious. Here, I would like to see some extreme ideas, some exploration into the unknown. I would just take, for example, a recent interview with Demis Hassabis and simply ask, what is his idea? Is the universe a computational machine? Absolutely. I mean, I think it's super important for a person to reflect on it this way. But if his view of nature is still correct, then how can we use this in life extension? That is, to see what solutions might emerge in some very unpredictable directions. I think this is where we need to go, and maybe we should set up some tasks, maybe organize a big, very creative seminar where we could try to push the topic forward without any restrictions. But what task is actually the best? How do you teach a machine to search for this task? Vitya, what does liquid task mean?
At the hackathon, we came up with several tasks that we could present at the hackathon. As I already mentioned, we rated them on a scale from 0 to 10. We decided to choose, perhaps, the least ambitious task, but one that is very well understood and has very clear criteria for whether a solution has been achieved or not. We know that we just published a paper where we developed a new method for generating biologically active molecules from proteins. It also uses modern machine learning, artificial intelligence, and a generative model. But we trained it on only 1 million data points from public sources. It is believed that patents contain about 10 times more data. If you think about it, people have spent tens of billions of dollars to obtain this data. But this data is stored in an unstructured form, as text tables, often written in legal English, which is different from regular English, and therefore extremely difficult to understand. We suggested that the teams create a series of agents that would search for patents with biological activity, read those patents, and extract data from them about molecules, their targets, and measured activities. And then they would make another agent that would curate this data, perform some kind of quality control, and produce data that could be compared with public datasets to assess the quality of manual data extraction.
Petr, so what about aging?
2 teams were able to extract the data, but also to build systems that quite reliably extracted thousands of activities in just a few days. And in the areas where activities are present in public databases, the results match the declared data with an extremely high correlation coefficient. So, continuing from what Vita is saying, yes, of course, you can't just abandon this kind of work, because it really works. And in general, even from a moral standpoint, it would be unethical to lose decades of people's work and billions of dollars spent on obtaining this data, without returning it to the community. We believe that this kind of work will definitely result in a publication. We are contracting with the 2 teams that we awarded at the hackathon. We hope that either with them, or with some combination of them, we will be able to bring this work to publication. I personally believe that any human labor deserves respect. If these people have created a working system, then in the future, I really think that sponsors of such projects should at the very least take on the responsibility of bringing it to publication. As they say, at GR it is believed that any such work should lead to some benefit, or at the very least, to a publication.
Wow, that's quite an interesting thing you're working on. So, you're trying to find a $100 billion drug that's been forgotten, lost in patents?
No, generative models are searching for new drugs. That is, generative models study, they generalize experience, and use it to search for new medicines. Of course, we're not talking about finding the drug we need in a patent. What we're talking about is all the knowledge humanity has accumulated, which is now getting lost in unstructured data. I've actually thought about this. So look, when all this was in libraries, it was basically impossible to use. Then Booba gathered it all in one place. That was already a huge step forward, right? But still, no one can read it all. Google has collected so much that no one can possibly read it all. And that's exactly when we meet agents, because agents are basically the only entities in the universe, as far as we know right now, that are capable of reading through the massive amount of data that Google has gathered. And generative models are capable of generalizing this data to such a level that a person can go into an interface. Let's say, on our Hugging Face platform, enter a protein and ask it to generate 20 molecules for experiments. We believe these are the components of the future, which is now becoming available to us piece by piece. We no longer read. We look at the results of generative models, which generalize things for us. We don't create datasets. We don't download them. We create them with the help of agents. We're offloading. This isn't even machine learning anymore. We're offloading onto agents a huge amount of work that would have been done by unskilled workers in third world countries. Yeah, well, it's no secret that patent databases are now compiled by souls. In my opinion, we're eliminating this terrible work where qualified people are paid next to nothing. We're handing it over to robots and keeping for ourselves the opportunity to create new medicines. As usual, there are lots of events, but not much news. Probably like in any other field, really. I've put together a small selection of things that caught my attention over the past week. Well, as you know, in our information bubble, there's no need to convince anyone that aging is something we should fight against. But as soon as you step outside, you realize that not everyone has come to this bright idea. In this sense, it's nice that Time magazine this week did. Oh, because we inevitably live longer, we get sick as we age, and something needs to be done about it. And once again, here we go, explaining to readers the difference between lifespan and health span, and the difference between living longer and living longer without disease. Many people probably already know my position. I believe this is a very dangerous trap that we are collectively falling into right now. Yes, of course, nobody wants to live poorly, and that's why everyone wishes for healthy longevity. The problem is that aging is not the same as disease, And focusing on diseases will lead to people being relatively healthy, but at the same time extremely frail. Aging is, first and foremost, a decline in function with age, and only secondly about diseases, not diseases that lead to a decline in function. I look at the development of this discourse with growing concern, because the discourse about the signs of aging created the longevity industry for the past 20 years, which we are now experiencing as a kind of boom, with significant amounts of money involved. A huge number of companies are working in this field. I'm afraid that if we don't manage to adjust this narrative about healthy longevity, we might end up trapped in a situation where we have lots of drugs for different diseases, but almost nothing is actually done about aging itself. I would probably point out as well, I'll start from society and move towards science, okay?
Yes. Let's pick up the pace a bit as we get into the system. Let me explain to the viewers what this is about. Look, we advocate for increasing life expectancy. We believe that a person is valuable in and of themselves, that no matter who they are, it's important for a person to live, and keep living. And that's a good thing. But there's another idea that says, well, people correct us, it's important that a person lives well. So, let's say we have a certain period of life, and our focus of attention should be directed at making the healthy period of life longer. But the overall lifespan itself isn't considered that fundamentally important. And this is always an add-on. Sometimes it's said outright, sometimes it's just implied. And it would seem that there shouldn't be any contradictions here, because the longer a person is healthy, the longer they live. So, it seems like it's the same goal, but in reality, both from a scientific perspective and from a cultural or psychological one, these goals are actually in conflict, which is quite remarkable, really. And here's where the conflict lies. In the second case, we diminish the value of life itself. In other words, we're saying, life itself isn't important to us. We only value it if it meets a certain standard of quality. Of course, it's clear that being bedridden, seriously ill, or having Alzheimer's is tough and undesirable. But being bedridden or having Alzheimer's is also a kind of loss of life. In the second case, it's the loss of personality. So, in fact, it's basically death. But this kind of position leads to a different approach in experiments as well. For example, they typically do not allow the mice to live out their full, natural lives. Instead, they meticulously observe significant changes in certain specific parameters and do not aim to let them simply die naturally. They humanely kill them in order to conduct various important and precise measurements. And then the nature of the experiments is not about lifespan, and we see that now they've found yet another combination, but this could have been discovered 10 years ago. Simply because the goal of extending life hasn't been set. Moreover, this doesn't lead to funding for life extension, but rather, for example, to the wellness industry, which is worth $5.5 trillion. So, it's a huge industry, all focused on quality of life, and 80% of it is wildly unproven. It's completely useless, precisely because quality is such a vague concept, anything at all can be considered to provide it, at least that's how it's seen in some circles. And here lies a very, very deep problem. In reality, no one. I mean, there are plenty of people who support the idea of, well, let's just agree on healthy longevity, let's talk about that, or even about healthy aging. Which is honestly really strange. What is a healthy disease anyway? Is it pleasant pain and dignified poverty? All of this is, of course, from who knows what kind of concoction, really.
I think I'll even bring it back to you here, and probably even tie it to the next point I wanted to discuss. Because with this focus on wellness, on a healthy lifestyle, it could very soon end up with the idea that, God forbid, if you're sick, it's the result of your own choices. If you had exercised, eaten well, you would have been healthy. And this could even lead to a kind of shaming. And in general, this focus on wellness could lead to the same thing that happened with obesity over the last 30 or 40 years. And now, with the emergence of powerful drugs for obesity, to such an extent that the New York Times wrote this week that the food industry's stock prices are falling. People have lost their appetite. People have stopped eating. People don't know what to stock their fridges with, what to sell to Americans, right? So basically, a biotechnology has emerged that is changing the economy, right? But experiments like this are rare. Now, there's a sort of post-mortem going on. What exactly happened? Why wasn't this drug created earlier? Now, several publications have come out where people examine how top officials in medicine and regulatory agencies, as well as corporate executives, viewed the problem of developing an obesity drug over the years. And so, in 2010, the director of Sanofi said, "You see, as long as obesity is considered a choice." Or rather, as long as society thinks that obesity is a choice and not a disease, regulators won't approve obesity drugs, and we won't develop them. That was in 2010. Sanofi. Now, of course, 15 years have passed, and we see that the drug has been created. This medicine is life-changing. Think again. This is how public views on obesity have prevented the development of a proper cure for obesity for a long time. That is possible. Public agenda. The politics of politics, not even politicians, people, but politicians as a polis. They lead us to believe that aging is normal. And as long as this paradigm dominates, we believe that a healthy lifestyle solves the problem. But if you don't lead a healthy lifestyle, that's your choice. It's not a disease. That's why no one is developing a cure for aging. I think this analogy should probably be traced, generalized to some extent, and used in the discourse. Because clearly, at least a decade has been lost in developing a drug for obesity, which has now led to a market where everyone wants an obesity drug.
Let's discuss some more news.
A truly remarkable article just came out about mitochondrial origins. I'm going to give a bit of a free translation here. Basically, you probably all know that lifespan is linked to body mass in animals that eat, and more or less in all other animals as well. The bigger the animal, the larger its size, the longer it lives. With some very interesting exceptions. And it turns out that the smaller the animal, the longer it sleeps. This might seem paradoxical, but in this study, they did a really good job and provided a lot of data showing that there are these remarkable laws in biology, called allometric or scaling laws, where, for example, metabolism increases more slowly than size. This means that metabolism per cell decreases. That's why large organizations always lose to small ones. Why do startups, small organizations, win? The bigger you are, the lower your metabolism per unit of mass, and the lower your productivity per person. That's why, once an organization reaches a certain size, Google can't provide the same level of productivity to its employees as a small startup can. That's why Google buys a small startup for $3 billion. That's the same law in action. In general, this is a dilemma, innovators and so on, which has been well studied in the humanities. In the physical sciences, there's an explanation, a wonderful book, by Jeffrey West. It's called Scale. I highly recommend reading it. So, what does this tell us? That in all sorts of shrews, mice, and so on, the metabolic needs of the brain per cell are much higher than in us, and even more so than in whales. That's why such little creatures get knocked out very quickly. That's why they can sleep for 10 or 15 hours a day, simply because otherwise their brains can't cope. This happened because the brain is actually a fairly recent evolutionary development. For most of life's history on our planet, animals existed in single-celled form, when there were no brains, when everything was more or less energetically balanced by diffusion within the cell. Then this remarkable, grand sedative event occurred, when oxygen almost wiped out all animals, and that's when mitochondria appeared. This gave our biosphere its first real boost and stabilized it. About 700 million years ago, tissue differentiation appeared and nervous systems emerged. But nervous systems, in terms of energy consumption, never caught up with all the other cells. Over these hundreds of millions of years, 2% of the body's mass consumes 20% of its oxygen. This means there's really no good way to supply it with enough food and oxygen. That's exactly why, the bigger the animal, the less oxygen it uses per unit of mass, and the less sleep it needs to make up for this metabolic debt. So, there was a cool study published, also by a large team of authors including Claudio Franceschi, in Nature Aging this week. Where? So, for a moment, this has actually been called into question. It's considered one of the so-called hallmarks of aging. As is well known, inflammation, specifically chronic inflammation without a clear cause, increases with age and is considered a universal sign of aging. Researchers compared this so-called inflammaging, age-related inflammation, in cohorts of people living in developed countries, like Singapore, where I am right now. It's scary to read. And in wonderful countries like Bolivia and so on, where people live in completely wild conditions, the researchers claim that the link between age and inflammation is much weaker in primitive cultures. And in these populations, inflammation is usually elevated in response to infections, not for some unclear reason like it is for us. So, compared to the article in Nature about sleep, where I brought these two studies together, because, on the one hand, both seem very important, but on the other hand, in one of them not only are the facts presented, but also extremely detailed explanations are provided, including experiments on animals, flies, and fruit flies, showing that the observations about the connection between metabolism and appetite are evolutionarily conserved and most likely, therefore, true. Yes, taking into account the large number of experiments. The second study, in my opinion, is a classic example in biology, where, unfortunately, although the facts are presented absolutely reliably, most likely, they are well reported. No explanations are provided. This means that in some third cohort, we might see something else. And so, well, it's a very interesting challenge that's been posed. I think science will have to explain this. And this brings me back, probably, to the whole discussion about how, as Professor Preobrazensky said, newspapers, what? You shouldn't read them before lunch. It's the same when you read scientific literature. There's always a lot of noise. This week, there are a lot of articles, and if you add them to the articles from the week before and the week before that, even on such short time scales, you'll notice some interesting inconsistencies. Some things will match up, and some won't. That's just an example of noise. Let me just give you a few article headlines as examples. Maybe someone will like it, or maybe someone will want to compare it with what they read a month ago. For example, it turned out that castration increases lifespan in mice. Yes. So we know that girls live longer than boys, despite menopause. And it turns out that if you castrate a boy mouse early, the lifespan of male and female mice evens out. And David Barzilai, who probably runs one of the biggest groups on Twitter where new studies in the field are highlighted every week, immediately suggested to Brian Johnson to consider an experimental approach, to do a new experiment. Then he reconsidered and said that, in principle, you could start by crushing up some estradiol as a more humane proxy. So, we're basically waiting for the master to weigh in on this issue. Psilocybin extends lifespan, not just healthy lifespan, but the overall lifespan of mice, which is pretty cool. This has already been reflected in recent studies, where it was shown that LSD also extends lifespan, including in worms. So, most likely, for all living things. And honestly, a troubled mind keeps me restless about a lot of things. As we know, treating the mind will definitely lead to increased lifespan. Calorie restriction slows the progression of atherosclerosis, thank God. A fatty diet, on the other hand, makes things worse in mice. Obesity comes more from calories. I just don't read. All of this is being written down. There are teams sitting there, working, calculating beer. So, this week you can be sure of one thing, but next week it'll be the opposite, I'm sure. But for now, you can be certain that obesity is caused by the caloric content of food, not by a lack of exercise. Let's ditch the exercise and cut the calories. Here's another study that shows exercise is actually a terrible thing, because it only increases your health span, but doesn't extend your lifespan at all. God bless everyone with good health. From the Concerning News, Brian Johnson wrote this week. I don't know if it's related to Barzilai's tweet, but anyway, Brian Johnson wrote that he wants to focus on the philosophy of his Don't Die movement and is looking for a CEO, searching for a general director for his blueprint. I don't really know what this means, but he thinks that society hasn't really accepted the idea of blueprint. There's a lot of negativity, even though he's giving people something truly invaluable. Overall, he seemed hurt in the interview, he thinks that.
Where is this? Where is the installation located?
The movement, the movement.
What was received negatively, the movement or Don't Die?
Blueprint. He wants to focus on Don't Die and hand over blueprint to smart, capable hands.
So, he is selling it, then,
Apparently, yeah.
He didn't succeed. That's business. That's how it is. That's the idea.
Yeah. Look, I'll add one more important thing. According to recent rumors, just a week or two ago, almost all major artificial intelligence chatbots suddenly and significantly reduced the number of explicit warnings saying that their answers are not to be considered medical advice, and they also completely stopped referring their users to professional doctors. There are also organizations that monitor various political and ethical standards in working with chatbots. So maybe the developers of these models believe that they work. Well, as we remember, several benchmarks have come out showing that, perhaps, such systems are increasingly performing no worse than doctors. So they've gotten bold enough to stop issuing warnings. But as usual, I don't like to comment from just one side. I always want to troll a little. At the same time, a truly remarkable article was published in Ars Technica. It even made it to the front page of Slashdot this week. It says that the number of cases where conversations with artificial intelligence lead people to psychiatric hospitals is growing. That is, because artificial intelligence is trained to support any kind of nonsense on the topic you're discussing. Conspiracy theorists get confirmation of their paranoid theories from AI and push things so far that they end up needing treatment. So that's the kind of interesting trend we've got. So I decided to gather up all sorts of crazy stuff on this topic. I've also noticed firsthand that people tend to look down on employees who use a lot of artificial intelligence at work. It's statistically significant. If your employee uses AI for a large number of tasks, people see them as not competent enough, not confident.
The employees think they're not competent.
The employees, not the company, the employees. And there's an even more interesting study that's been published. They took top-level programmers and surveyed them. It's like a bad joke about a survey and measurements in 2 villages. So, on one hand, they asked developers how much AI helps them, and on the other, by counting the number of code commits from these people, they measured how long it took them to make changes. So, it turned out that developers believe AI speeds up coding, but the number of commits before reaching a final solution actually increased, and the time spent also went up. In other words, in reality, more time is spent, but the feeling about the work improves. Well, and probably the last thing I'll say from what I've gathered, what caught my attention, is that right now, as you know, the adaptation of Foundation by Asimov is on screen, a classic work. Asimov became Asimov after he wrote Foundation. It's possible that science fiction as a genre even appeared after Foundation. The rights from Asimov's relatives were bought by Apple, and they made a film. Supposedly, the film, according to rumors, is very different from the book, but I'd like to point out something that probably many people notice. Misha and I once discussed this. In 20th century science fiction, people fly into space, explore the galaxy, but they still live as many years as usual. The topic of radical life extension or immortality is barely represented in science fiction. So, for example, in Star Wars or somewhere like that, you won't see people living for 1,000 years. It's the same in the Foundation universe. There's a civilization on a galactic scale, but people still live normal lifespans. So, in the adaptation, Foundation was written around 1945, but the adaptation came out in 2025. And in 2025, the theme of immortality in the Foundation adaptation actually runs through several storylines. So, in the galaxy, there's a robot who's been immortal for tens of thousands of years and controls the galaxy. Well, it's the same thing in Foundation. The emperors of the Galactic Empire are clones. Basically, it's one immortal emperor who is continuously cloned, and that's how he remains immortal, as a clone, right? So, it's this idea of immortality through cloning. And finally, the engineers of the Foundation live long lives to prevent some kind of catastrophe by alternating between living and cryosleep. So, pretty much all the concepts, from digital immortality to immortality through cloning or immortality through cryosleep, are present in these works and are used to build the storylines. I'd probably point out here that, apparently, the world really has changed. If in 1945 you could write about the future of a technological civilization without discussing the idea of immortality, then by 2025 it's already extremely hard to find a movie about a galactic civilization interesting if it doesn't have immortal characters. I think this is a really cool shift, that people had to break the script of a great author in order to make this work more relevant. I'm also adding this to the piggy bank of social changes, which can be tracked by biomarkers like Hollywood. As we know, Hollywood looks a bit further ahead and builds and paints the future for us. I think this is a very good sign.
Well, and to continue your thought, we can see that, yes, in the next few years, 1, 2, maybe 3, people will figure out who they are in longevity, in life extension. So it will be this kind of system of views. If before, people might not have had an opinion, might not have had any thoughts about life extension, now people will form one. Clusters will appear, belonging to this biohacking, some people.
A battle of narratives. A new NAR. Right now, there's a bifurcation point when a new narrative is being created about aging. You see, even Hollywood is already thinking about it, so we should start thinking about it too. And you know, in cases like this, sorry to interrupt, in cases like this, I like to say that in the multiverse, everything is very clear. In 100 years, people will live long lives, there will be few diseases, and so on. But in a specific realization of this multiverse here, the trajectory of how we get there depends on which narrative wins out right now.
And this battle of memes, the battle of narratives, that's the most interesting and most important thing in. Which cultural patterns will win, and who stands for what? And here, too, a hackathon on social data would be a pretty good idea.
A great little hackathon, yeah?
Yeah, that would be really interesting, because we mentioned at our event, like, come on, people, look, here are social data, and they're pretty active, so we need to set these kinds of tasks. We also still have the task about tasks. We're in a constant recursion.
The goldfish task, artificial intelligence. Come up with 3 wishes for me, right? So.
Right. And I, from these tea, and will hold, like, in about 2 weeks, a contest on how to formulate it. Let's go into social data. Maybe we can do it without too much hassle. Just make a social hackathon with social data. We'll find some data to give to people.
I don't know. Naz, Mish, our team's task has been solved. My team thinks that now you have to present it at the hackathon in September. Now you know, with all of this.
I really want to, like, jump into the battle of narratives and try to do something. I think, listen, the science of memes is actually developing quite well with scientific articles. Well, about memes as agencies of cultural information and science.
Right now, we just need to push this topic as aggressively as possible into the public space. Otherwise they'll, you know. Before, they agreed on the signs of aging. Now they'll agree on a health plan. Then we're definitely all going to die.
Yeah. This Kremlin, it's like this camp has practically won, damn it. Well, at least it won in 2004 and it might win again in 2025. Who knows? We need to do something about this. Yeah, listen, there's an interesting post about Brian. I need to go read it, see what's going on with him. Friends.
As they say, the duty officer for Immortality has handed over his post, so.
Friends, thank you so much. Vit, thank you for being with us.
Yes, Vit, it was really nice too.
To talk about longevity and life extension.
Meet you and work together. It was honestly a pleasure. Our whole creative team really enjoyed it.
Wishing you truly amazing things.
Thank you so much, friends. It was a real pleasure for me too. By the way, I think what's important is, of course, the teams that create products. And I think we had a really great team here, and Petya's support was huge as well. The support from the Open Longevity team was tremendous. I feel like I've heard a lot of compliments about how well we organized everything, but we have to admit, it was a big team effort. That's true. So let's not lose touch with each other, friends.
Aging isn't going to defeat itself, you know. When everyone else tells you all those memes about this political work.
As Svetlana Asimova sings, live and don't die.
I won't sing. I need to learn first. All right, bye.
Bye.